the heart of Jesus' message was that the Basileia Theou is near, and that is, in the usual biblical translations, the kingdom of God. And I think that it has been a terrible loss in much of the history of the church, that language has played a rather small role, or has been seriously misidentified. It's misidentified when one identifies the kingdom of God with the church. As Jesus taught us about the kingdom of God, we can certainly say it provides a way of thinking that should have great influence within the church, but to identify the complex institutional church with all of its flaws and weaknesses with the kingdom of God has been wrong. And it's interesting that in Protestantism, the idea of the kingdom of God played a rather small role for a long time, and it was picked up by the social gospel. And this was a great gain. I think it's preached about much too little in our churches, even in our liberal churches, to the present time. There's been a lot of scholarship on the subject of what does Jesus mean by the kingdom of God. I think we can say a few things that have fairly solid scriptural basis and among critical scholars. And I think that what they lead to is a vision that is somewhat misleadingly translated as the kingdom of God. So I'm going to make a comment about that, and then I'll go back to the other. I've decided it would be better to speak of the divine commonwealth, or you can say the commonwealth of God. That's when you say the kingdom of God, you introduce a basic monarchical image into the relationship between God and human beings and the world. Jesus does not use the language of God as king. I don't think there is any passage. Certainly it is not. It is not Jesus' major way. Jesus addresses God as Papa. And I think Papa would be an odd language to use if you want to talk to the emperor, or what one normally thinks of as king. So I think that Jesus' emphasis upon the kingdom of God was upon the way in which human beings relate to each other in community, an inclusive community, and of course a community in which God's purposes are fulfilled. But if we ask what it is that fulfills God's purposes, or does God's will, because of course the Lord's Prayer is a very central part of the way in which we can think of what Jesus means, the language of obeying is not the primary. Is not the primary language. God's will is done when human beings love each other. God's will is done when we take care of each other and include others in the fellowship. So, if we take Jesus seriously, I think we need to avoid monarchical language if possible, and to avoid an emphasis upon obedience, and think much more of sonship. We are brothers and sisters one of another, and we are all children of God. That language is much more directly suitable to Jesus' message. So when Jesus proclaims that it is at hand, it seems to have a double meaning. I think most scholars mean that. It's at hand in the sense that already, some people would say in principle, in partial realization, present in the table fellowship of Jesus. The table fellowship was unusual in that it was an open table fellowship. people who were generally excluded from the meal were included in Jesus' table fellowship. But, of course, Jesus wanted more than that there would be just one little group around him that was realizing it. I think we can see that something very much like what Jesus meant by the basileia theou was realized in the communities that Paul began around the Mediterranean world. If you study Paul's letters, of course there were problems, just as there were problems in table fellowship around Jesus. Judas was sitting there and he betrayed Jesus. It's not perfection, but Paul was also seeking communities in which mutual love was the primary quality that realized them. Now, these communities were not revolutionary in the sense of directly opposing the government, but it's interesting that governments didn't like them. Jesus got executed, crucified, Paul was killed, Christians were persecuted, even though they did most of the things good citizens were supposed to do. So they were revolutionary in the sense that they showed there was a different way of being human, a different way of living, even in the context of a great empire based on wealth and power. It was possible for human beings to find another way of being. And I started out by saying, let's not identify this with the church, but let's not totally disconnect it. There are many congregations, I believe, in which the internal life of the congregation is much more a matter of mutual loving support and nurture than it is of some people controlling and oppressing others. And even though that happens in the church, obviously, that's why I don't want any identification. But I think that what we are called to do is to create communities in which there is authentic acceptance, which are genuinely open to those that the world excludes, and that live by a different message, a different drummer. And of course, the hope is that these communities will have a great influence upon the wider society, and so that the ultimate ideal would be that the whole world would change its value system, would live in a radically different way.